We'll get started in about 1 minute. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar. I want to thank everyone that's joining us, whether you are watching live or you're listening online. We're going to start our presentation shortly, but in just a few notes about our format for today. We will begin with a pre-recorded video for the first portion of this webinar. And as you're listening, please feel free to post questions using the Q&A feature down in the taskbar at the bottom of your screen. We'd also ask that you keep in mind that our purpose today is to engage in this conversation about the lens of anti-racism in secondary math and science classrooms. We are not experts on this panel, but we are all panelists that acknowledge the importance of these conversations and of putting this work into practice. Momentarily, we're going to be turning our cameras off to begin the pre-recorded portion. And then at the end, we will come back on and have an opportunity for the live Q&A. Also, I just want to remind all of the people that are watching that after today's session, you'll also be receiving a survey. We'll be asking for your feedback on today's session, as well as input into some future webinars that the Institute for Urban Education can possibly do for our audience. In addition, we'll be sharing a link throughout or within the session today that will contain the resources that are discussed and utilized. So you'll have access to those right away as well. So thank you again for joining us. At this time, we're going to begin with the pre-recorded portion of our session. So panelists, we can go ahead and turn our cameras off and mute. Of interest. And so today we are happy to have a panel of teachers from the Kansas City community to include and contribute to this conversation. My name is Jen Fergerson. I'm a project coordinator with the Institute for Urban Education here at UMKC. I am joined today by Chaur Jacobson, who will be co-facilitating with me. Chaur is an instructional coach in the Turner School District. She's also a doctoral candidate here at UMKC. The Institute for Urban Education is a cohort scholarship program for pre-service teachers that focuses on preparing and supporting future teachers to work in the richly diverse schools within Kansas City. We hope today's webinar is of support for all schools and teachers engaged in this challenging but imperative work of equity and social justice in education. The format for our session is as follows. First, we'll provide a little context around the topic of an anti-racist lens in secondary math and science classrooms. Then we'll have an opportunity to hear from our panelists as they provide some examples of the ways that they engage in this work. And finally, we'll have a live Q&A with our panelists at the end for those of you that are watching to be able to ask questions, and we'll engage in a discussion around this work. Our main goals for today's session are for you to be able to describe what anti-racist teaching can look like and describe anti-racist strategies or practices that you might incorporate into your teaching. Anti-racist teaching is a term that has been on the rise. Before we get into discussing with our panel what this can or might look like in math and science classrooms, we're going to take a moment to consider what it might mean from a big picture perspective. We'll take a look at some questions that might help us think about that larger picture, and then we'll narrow the focus for math and science teachers. The quote you see here comes from the book, We Want to Do More Than Survive, Abolitionist Teaching and the Pursuit of Educational Freedom by Bettina Love. This quote articulates the variety of ways that educators contribute to the idea of anti-racist and abolitionist teaching. There's not one specific way, but many ways to look at it. And so while much of what we discuss today may center on curriculum and teaching approaches or assessment, it's important to note that there are other ways to engage in this work. None of our panelists today would claim to be an expert on the topic. Instead, we are all practitioners learning and striving to do what's best for the students in our classrooms. In looking at multiple sources about exactly what kinds of behaviors or practices anti-racist educators embody, there are many commonalities. First, they are self-reflective, both in their practice as well as when examining and re-examining their own biases and beliefs. They are learners that are constantly reading and watching, discussing with peers, and taking some form of action. They recognize racism as a systemic issue embedded in our country as well as in our schools, and are working to not only understand it and understand themselves, but also finding ways to empower and engage students. Additionally, anti-racist educators commonly engage in some of these kinds of ways. They take students of color seriously. They consider the larger picture, thinking holistically about schools. Their teaching is grounded in the lives of their students as they create environments of hope and joy and kindness. And they hold students to high expectations to empower and engage them. Gloria Ladson-Billings' work on culturally relevant teaching includes these three areas: academic achievement, cultural competence, and socio-political critical consciousness. Academic achievement refers to growth, high levels of support, and high expectations. Cultural competence refers to engaging students in ways that embraces their culture and their lives. And finally, socio-political critical consciousness refers to the ways we engage and connect the learning to their worlds and communities in topics that are relevant, that inform their critical thinking and develop that critical thinking so that we are creating informed and thoughtful citizens. So as we look at academic achievement here, you can see on the left that we have some general reflective questions that we might ask ourselves as we think about academic achievement through the lens of anti-racism. We might ask ourselves things like, how much growth has occurred in my class? What data, aside from assessment data, is showing progress? In other words, am I only looking at standardized assessments, or am I taking note of conversations that are happening? Am I taking a look at other kinds of work that students are producing? What students are improving and why? As we think about this same lens through math and science, we might narrow our questions a bit. How do I allow for students to develop a positive math or science identity? How do I involve students in their data and their progress? Are my expectations the same for my students of color as they are for my white students? And maybe asking ourselves why or why not. And finally, we see some examples of some specific practical applications that we might consider around academic achievement with this lens of anti-racism. It might look like allowing our students to develop their own goals, creating or developing multiple ways to assess students. It might look like allowing opportunities for students to develop alternative solutions to problems, as far as looking at assessment in a slightly different way. Next, we'll look at cultural competence through this lens of anti-racism. In thinking here, we're thinking generally about how this looks. We might ask ourselves what you see here in this first column. Are there more stories or histories that I need to consider, or I need to learn as the instructor so that I can engage my students? Does the curriculum convey white culture as regular or the norm, or does it present all cultures? So when we think then about more specific to math and science classrooms, we might ask ourselves, are there opportunities to provide relevant contexts for the content? What kind of background or historical information or theories do I provide for students about the content? And is there any opportunity there? Do I consider language when allowing students to process through the content? Some of the practical applications you see here are things like sharing biographies of scientists or mathematicians of color that are relevant to the content, highlighting mathematical history that is not Eurocentric, allowing students space to consider perspectives presented in their content, and are there perspectives that are missing? Allowing students to provide contexts for the content, like allowing students to come up with those ideas for themselves, or consciously creating that as a way to teach the content. As an example, last year I observed in a middle school science classroom where students were learning about the coronavirus, not only as a virus, but as well as analyzing the data around or about the virus. And so more recently, we know that COVID has disproportionately impacted people of color. So could this be the type of relevant topic to be used as a lens to teach math or science? The Zinn Project is a site that is devoted to providing examples of lessons across multiple content areas. It's focused on alternative perspectives, social justice, and equity. There's an example on the site where a high school math teacher wanted students to talk about statistics that, quote, prove the racism that many of them experience. And this group of students collected and analyzed data that compared local communities. And so doing this kind of relevant work is just something to consider. And the Zinn Project, or the Zinn Education Project, is a resource that might be a starting point for some of us to be looking into. Finally, we have our socio-political critical consciousness. Here we might ask ourselves things like, do I provide choice? Do I value all viewpoints? Am I projecting my own personal beliefs into the learning? Or what opportunities do students have to express their stories, their opinions, or their ideas? As we think about math and science, we get a little more specific again. So why is this concept important to the students in my classroom? Is there something missing from my curriculum that might benefit students? Or how do I allow students to engage in discussion about the power of math or science as a tool that changes the world? And then in some of these practical applications, you can see things are highlighted. Things are highlighting people in the world that use math as a form of resistance. You can see examples of context that is relevant in students' lives. There's the example of the New York City students that you see here, as well as in Pennsylvania. Learning might be framed around justice-centered phenomena, such as inequitable land or resource use. You might use that context of adverse health impacts, food security, the disproportionate impacts of shifting lands and waters, for example, floods, storms, and droughts, and how that impacts communities and lives. Community and citizen projects can take a lot of interest and perspective into account and promote social progress. Here we have a list of some websites that we will be providing in our Wakelet. Our Wakelet will kind of be all the resources that are discussed today, as well as any of the videos, and as well as this PowerPoint presentation for anyone to access. And some of these are just places that teachers might begin and get some ideas around the different ways that they might engage in this kind of work through this math and science content. This social justice math and radical math are both really focused on providing resources and lesson plans. And then you have the National Science Teacher Association blog that also does the same thing around science and then STEM teaching as well. And then finally, we have a chart here that is on a site called facingourhistory.org. And this particular chart is, or this particular site is really focused on more of a social studies kind of lens. However, this particular resource really can be utilized across any content area. Now, I will say that this is a site that you have to sign up for, but it is free. And once you sign up, you have access to multiple resources. So here you see some general ideas for protocols or structures that you might utilize in your classroom to support, to support students in having these kinds of conversations. So if you're wanting students to engage in any of these kinds of ways within a math and science classroom, you have these structures or strategies to support those conversations or that learning. And then the other nice thing about this particular chart is it has adapted some of these protocols to be more responsive to students that are in remote learning. And so that's just another highlight or plus to this particular site. And finally, we know that doing this work is challenging, but we know that those of us that are engaged in this work are trying to do what is right and trying to be better and do better and continue to learn and grow. And so the focus needs to be on doing what's right for students in our classrooms. Here are references that we utilized for the presentation today. As I mentioned, these will be in our Wakelet that we'll be dropping into the chat shortly. And so at this time, we will move to the live portion of our session. I want to take this moment while we're transitioning to our live presentation to thank Jordan Smith. Jordan works with the IUE here at UMKC and is kind of doing our behind the scenes work today. So thank you, Jordan. So at this time, we're going to transition to our panelists for today. And our panelists are going to be providing some examples that they have, ways that they are using the lens of anti-racism to influence their math and science classrooms. So we go first to Brian Phillips. Brian Phillips is our first panelist today. Brian has a bachelor's in mathematics from Maranatha. Brian, you're going to have to help me out with that later. Baptist University, and a master's in teaching and learning from Avila University. He has experience in private and parochial schools, as well as he had been the director of education at Sylvan Learning Centers. And he has been teaching math at Center High School here in Kansas City for the past 14 years. He teaches dual credit courses and AP classes.
Good afternoon. My name is Brian Phillips, math teacher here at Center High School in Kansas City, Missouri. This is my 28th year in a math classroom, my 14th at Center. I've taught every math class that our school offers, from remedial algebra to my current teaching load of college algebra, statistics, and calculus. I have been asked to give some ways I address the topic of the math classroom through an anti-racist lens. First of all, I still have so much to learn on this, as we all do. And I know we'll all continue to learn each and every day, especially as we teach our students. I think we would all agree that many times we learn as much from our students as they learn from us. I do have 3 quick thoughts I wanted to share with you. First, I feel it's important in urban education that we ensure that every kid, Black, brown, white, Hispanic, Asian, each and every one of them hears that I am in this with them. I'm here to support you. I'm here to encourage you to teach. I'm here to cheer you on. I'm going to be a cheerleader for you. But the learning is on them. It's their education, and they need to work. I'm not going to leave them hanging. I'm here to help them. And I'm definitely going to be there each and every day to support them and encourage them to do what I can. But the learning is on them. The second thing that I've learned in urban education is to re-examine the way I assess. While paper and pencil tests are fine, there are other ways to assess. Formative assessments in a math classroom could take on many different forms. Oral testing, project-based, collaborative work, presentations. There's all sorts of numbers of ways to assess what the growth looks like in students. And of course, we need to examine the growth of the different demographics. Are my white students progressing faster? Are my African American students struggling in certain areas? Or we can go down to genders, well, males versus females, and how are they progressing? So we can examine that in so many different ways. The third thing I've learned is that we can't enable our students. This is something that we've been discussing at our school recently, that not giving kids more than what they need. Many times students don't have the support at home, and we end up in many ways taking on the role of a parent to some. Um, so yes, first of all, it's our job to give them the tools. Teach the skills, provide opportunity for practice in a variety of different formats, a variety of different ways. Give that constructive feedback. Um, you know, allow them to make their corrections, but then make sure that they are using these tools, using these skills. After we teach them how to take notes, make sure they're using their notes or um, uh, reference sheets, things like that. But we're not using it for them. Make sure that they are doing it, that they're applying these tools in new situations. Not making excuses for them, not accepting excuses from them. We need to make sure that they are taking ownership, that they're investing in their own learning. Then they will build the skills and they'll rise to the expectation that we set. But it's on them. We're there to cheer and to help, but we can't enable them in that way. In fact, in my humble, ridiculous opinion, is one of the most racist things we can do for a student in my classroom is to lower my expectation. So many times we want to, as teachers, we want to save our children, we want to save our students, save them from a failing grade. When in reality, that's not helping them. We're not doing them any favors. In fact, I would say we're doing them a disservice by excusing their behavior, excusing their attitude, and not insisting on their very best. I'm going to give them my very best. I expect nothing less in return. By not giving them the tools to be a better student, even a better person or citizen, by lowering that bar, I'm doing my students a disservice. And I think in urban education, it's a very important thing that we stop doing and give them the opportunities, but then the opportunities are for them. So I'm anxious to continue this conversation. This is just a few ideas that I've had. I'm anxious to hear what others have to say. So thank you for the opportunity.
Next, we have Sara Saunders. Sara is an alumni of the Institute for Urban Education, and she is a middle school math teacher in Kansas City, Kansas Public Schools.
Hello, my name is Sara Saunders, and I'm a 7th grade math teacher in the KCK Public School District. When I think about what it means to be anti-racist, to me that is looking at the systems that are in place that promote racial inequalities and equities and working to repair and fix those to make it more equitable for people who have been historically discriminated against and not given the same opportunities. In education, as we know, there's a deep systemic history of making things unequal for students of color. We see this today still by the lack of resources, the lack of rigor in curriculum, the way things are being taught, and the overall lack of expectations for our students. So in my own classroom, I try to even this playing field as much as possible while giving my students the opportunity to learn things that will help them even their playing field in their future as adults. One of the things I work on every year with my students is understanding the importance of financial literacy. Opportunities for financial stability is a huge problem for many people of color in our country due to systems that are in place for hiring, equal pay, educational opportunities or the lack thereof that do not always allow our students to achieve a higher education, which in turn allows them to not have the same job opportunities. Over the years, I've noticed that many of my students have never heard of some of the common terms used when we discuss money. For example, deposits and withdrawals. So we focus a lot on these concepts when covering rational numbers as a way to not only help them understand positive and negative change, but to also ensure that they understand how banking works. One activity I had them do is to balance a checkbook using a list of transactions, and we talk about the importance of keeping records of spending. We then discuss how we can prevent ourselves from going into the negative, as well as what to do if we do end up with a negative bank account. We also talk about the different types of banking systems, such as credit unions versus a regular bank, and the pros and cons of each. I also like to teach them about the importance of budgeting and bargain shopping. We discuss this in class when we discuss how to find unit rates by finding unit prices of things like cereal, shampoo, and other common things, and why it's important to try to stay within a specific budget. One activity I have them do is online shopping, where they're given a specific amount of money that they can spend on specific items that they need to buy. They then use unit rates to determine which size is the most cost effective and the best use of their money. When I teach percentages, we discuss their thoughts on tipping based on what they've been seeing or what they've been taught in their own lives. We then talk about the job of a waiter or a waitress, things to be mindful of when they're out, and how to tip for a service. I also like to teach them how to tip quickly using 20% as a number, which also plays into their importance of number sense. Teaching my students how to be financially literate is one way I work towards anti-racism, as it is important to prepare them for their futures. Being financially literate is a good way to ensure proper credit, which we as adults know is key to obtaining things like a house, a car, a business, and more. Another way I work towards anti-racism is by creating problem solvers. More and more jobs are requiring the ability to solve problems, and by nature, mathematicians are problem solvers. I tell my students every day that it's never enough to know how we do something, but we must also work to understand the whys behind it. Knowing the whys of math allows students to see problems that they may have never practiced before, but are still able to solve it based on the knowledge they already have about numbers and how numbers work together. It also teaches them to think broader and deeper when they're faced with a problem they've never seen before. Many of our state tests and college entrance exams have problems that they may have never seen or are worded weirdly. So when students know how and the whys of math, it helps to close that gap and allow more opportunities for them to still be successful on those type of tests. These are some of the ways I'm working in my classroom to encourage anti-racism. There are several others, but these are some of the ones that I've been using over the years that I've seen pretty successful. Thank you.
And last but not least, we have Jennifer Moriarty. Jennifer has been teaching math in urban Kansas City for 6 years. She currently teaches calculus, pre-calculus, and teaching as an act of social justice, which is a partnership with the Institute for Urban Education at Crossroads Preparatory Academy. Prior to teaching, she earned her bachelor's degree in math and economics at the University of Kansas and has a Master of Education from the University of Missouri, St. Louis.
Hi everyone, my name is Jennifer Moriarty and I'm honored to present to you how I strive to create an anti-racist secondary math classroom. I've taught math at the high school level for 6 years, everything from Algebra 1 to AP Calculus. I currently teach calculus and pre-calculus at Crossroads Prep Academy in downtown Kansas City. I'm going to start with some smaller actionable steps and end with some more philosophical calls to action in the creation of anti-racist math education. So we can start with a practice that I found much success in and am still developing, which is intentional collaboration that addresses status. As I'll expand on later, mathematics is exploration and discovery of patterns in the world around us. Mountains of research for decades has come to the conclusion that students learn best when they're socially engaged with other people. Our social structure in class and society as a whole is based on our culture, and in the United States, our culture is one of deeply seated inherent racism. Systemic racism in math classrooms exists in many forms, including how and to whom teachers deliver praise and encouragement in understanding content. One way I found success in developing an anti-racist classroom is by incorporating heterogeneous collaborative teams as part of daily practice and acknowledging the status that exists in those teams. How I, as the teacher, acknowledge the perception of each student's academic capability and social desirability that exists in those teams, and how I use it to act intentionally can transform a classroom from one where students dominate or are marginalized by their status to one where students are all empowered to achieve. And most importantly, where all students have the tools and mindset to work together and understand that they benefit from working with a diverse set of people. Some strategies I use are team roles, so all people have a specific purpose and they all meaningfully contribute to a group success. I also strive to model and consistently reinforce productive, neutral, collaborative talk, such as I agree because, or I want to push a response to. And of course, shutting down and immediately addressing any instances of status domination or student marginalization is key in implementing productive anti-racist collaborative practices. Building a culture of safety and inclusion in the classroom must continue by acknowledging and making space for current events. One of the main ways I've always struggled as a teacher of mathematics is how to make my classroom culturally responsive. And that's one of the most vague, irritating buzzwords in all of education because it takes something so complex and it boils it down to 2 words that by themselves are honestly completely meaningless. When my only piece of accountability is how well my students can regurgitate the quadratic formula on a standardized test, combined with my own whitewashed memorization-based math educational experience, it makes bringing culture to my classroom seem impossible, but of course it's not, and it cannot be thought of as impossible. We must prioritize teaching culture. What happens in the world matters, and it's important to create the culture in our math classrooms that we are not disconnected from the rest of the world. Creating the time and space to grieve a loss, to celebrate victories, and everything in between is bringing culture to your classroom. Having the flexibility and compassion to alter your curriculum to better serve young people is what's important, not the bottom line of simply powering through your curriculum. If students need an open forum to process election results, if students need a space to cry and grieve the loss of an important figure, if students need to protest yet another incidence of police brutality, if students need to celebrate the passing of an important piece of legislature, it's imperative that math teachers provide that space to show up for kids and prove that we are really in this fight for justice with them. Students with knowledge of the intersection of mathematics and society are formidable forces. When a culture of empathy is created in our classrooms, students are better able to show up fully, vulnerably, to persist, and to fight for their liberation in and outside of the classroom. In that fight for liberation, we teachers have to stop using math as a tool of oppression. We use mathematical logic daily because we're alive and we have to problem solve to survive. We should be making it easier to survive by giving people the power to think more logically and become better problem solvers. However, the way that math has been taught for centuries has been a tool of oppression to maintain separate classes, those who have the opportunity to survive more easily and those who don't. This quote from S.E. Anderson depicts only one example of why mathematics is inherently oppressive in Eurocentric societies like ours. Entire populations were systematically and intentionally denied human rights because of fear of a loss of power by the ruling class. Look who's achieving at your school. Why, even in our most progressive schools, are math scores so poor and the proportions of students by race not representative of the entire student body in our advanced math courses? That's a big question that deserves big consideration, and solutions are not small or easily implemented. Mathematics knowledge is liberation. Solutions and ultimate liberation require an overhaul of our inherently racist system. And that takes me to my final call to action, which is to fight for educational reform. Math with no context or application, as well as the traditional track of Algebra 1, Geometry, Algebra 2, is not conducive to creating mathematical problem solvers. At a minimum, pushing for integrated math curricula is a start, but beyond that, why aren't we looking at the history of mathematics and how much creativity and persistence math requires? Why aren't we exposing children to experiences where logical thought is organic and applicable? I'm convinced at this point that all of middle school mathematics could honestly be taught on a construction site, and it infuriates me that students are being taught in just a vacuum of a classroom, and that teachers are accountable for maintaining a broken system like that. Math is exploration at its core. It's brought to us from diverse cultures across millennia, from Egypt, China, India, Mesopotamia, Mesoamerica, even though most mathematical ideas that are taught to this day are attributed to the European men who discovered that which was already created. Important mathematicians from any culture were also notable philosophers. So boiling down math to formulas and memorization of arbitrary facts only to be regurgitated and forgotten is doing a massive disservice to our future leaders. Students should be building things, working as a team, and being exposed to new opportunities and experiences. Mathematics education is so far from what it should be because we condense students down to test scores to get funding or to entice parents who are still tied to traditional methods and measures to come to our schools. This is an institution that should be dismantled and rebuilt to better serve our society, and it's the primary obligation of an anti-racist teacher to fight for that radical change. So thanks so much for engaging with me. And here's a list of the sources I've used for this presentation, and I hope to be working with you all in rethinking and rebuilding education.
So thank you to our panelists for sharing those ideas. At this time, I'm going to ask all of us to turn our cameras back on, and we will start the live Q&A portion. I would just remind those of you that are watching, if you have any questions from anything that you've listened to or examples that you've heard, feel free to drop those questions in the chat, as well as you're listening to the conversation. If anything comes up that you want to ask, feel free to do that as well. I'm going to piggyback off of one of the things Jennifer, there you are. One of the things Jennifer kind of said during your presentation, Jennifer, you said, looking at who is achieving and why. And I'm just kind of wondering, when you, what kind of support do you think that teachers need in order to be thinking about that, or what kinds of ways, how do you all find support in your schools for doing this kind of thinking and having these kinds of conversations?
I think my biggest support has been administrative support and parent support. I think having an administration that believes that things need to be changed, and having an administration that is supportive of kind of pushing the envelope and not being tied to traditional standards has been huge. I think having resources, which, if it was so easy to get, that would be great, but resources like time and money to take students on like different learning experiences, things like that. But administrative support, resources, and collaborating with peers. I know I actually wrote down some of the websites that you shared in your presentation, because I haven't heard of those before. And it's really important to have a time and space to collaborate as well.
For any of the panelists, what other barriers besides time and space are you finding are getting in the way of an anti-racist teaching practice? And how maybe do you work around those barriers?
I think for me, the biggest ones are time and space, but and then the lack of resources. But I think another barrier that I face is in my building, we have to be on the same pace with our teachers that teach the same content area and grade level. And so trying to convince other teachers that this is good work and having them actually do the hows and the whys and the more realistic and relevant practice has been a barrier. So trying to help other teachers see that that lens as well is usually another barrier I face.
I'd have to agree with several of those. The time and space is definitely a barrier. I think part of it with the AP or dual credit classes, you're limited on time as far as you have to get through certain material, a certain point. But I think the biggest help is administration. I think their support and between you and the central office, between you and the curriculum, whatever it may be, just their support is so important.
What if you think about some of the practices or rules or norms that you have in your classroom, as you've kind of probably, as we all kind of gone on this journey of what it means to be an anti-racist educator, how have you, or what would you like, how have you changed? What kinds of things have you found yourself changing to move in and make your classrooms more anti-racist?
I think incorporating collaborative strategies is huge. And I'm lucky to have a curriculum right now where that's kind of embedded, but when that's certainly not the case across the board, it's hard to do, and it's a lot of work, but it's so effective in having good intentional collaborative strategies and making that a priority so students are learning together and taking on the cognitive load.
And I'll just piggyback off of that, Jennifer. I agree. Collaboration is huge. This is probably the hardest part of being online for me right now, is that they don't have as much collaboration time, because I feel like there's so much good work that can be done, dissecting stuff and learning together. So I think that that's probably one of the biggest things, is not giving the answers and making them work together, take problems that I didn't even teach them how to do, and then figure out how to solve those together.
How are you managing that online right now? What does that, can you kind of give us some ideas about what that looks like realistically?
Realistically, It is very frustrating, I think, for me personally, because so much of my pedagogy and my thoughts and teaching is collaboration. So I have been trying to maneuver between my iPad, my phone, and my computer screen so I can do breakout rooms with them. But since they don't know each other as well, they're just still in the chat working together. So I've tried Jamboard, which is like giving me some bits of success and like them kind of collaborate and they can see it visually. And so that's been helpful. But just that conversation piece, I think, is still kind of missing. But at least the Jamboard and the chat, they are able to still kind of talk to each other in some way.
Yeah.
I have my math department coaches actually gave me a great idea, and it was kind of using the chat just because it's so easy to not participate when you're on Zoom and just kind of sit back and take it in. So one thing that has been really helpful is cold calling, and then beyond that, like using the chat. So like, oh, like it looks like Chaur entered this answer. Sara, do you agree with her? Or Sarah, do you agree with her or not? And explain why. So like kind of cold calling and then intentionally asking those questions to kind of get them talking and participating. But you know, when it's in breakout rooms and you can only be in one, it's it's hard.
That's where the multiple devices I figured for Zoom is helpful, but it's difficult though because you hear all the different ones at one time and they just hear in their room, so it's like a real battle.
Yeah.
I know for collaboration, we don't use Zoom, we use Microsoft Teams. And we're able to make other little rooms and stuff on the side as well. And it's been nice. I've had a co-teacher this semester, so I can send him to one room and have the kids work together, and it's great. And I'm losing him in the spring, so I'm trying to figure out some way to keep that collaboration up because it is so important.
Yeah.
But then I've also been using just to get kids talking because. Or at least give me feedback, because a lot of kids don't want to get on, kind of like me. I don't like my face on camera. Don't want to get on the camera, don't want to show their room, don't want to show where they're at, don't want to talk necessarily. We use Pear Deck, which allows us kids to respond directly. And it's great. I can sit here and I can watch all the kids responding quietly. And I have just learned that here in the past month, and it's been good for me as a tool. But once again, just getting every kid to, some kids like to talk, and some kids, this is getting away from it's not even a race issue, it's just personalities. Some kids don't want to talk, some kids do, some kids want to are participating quietly. So that's been a great tool for me to use. I'd like to try this Jamboard. I'd like to look into that and see what that's about. So
Can I share one idea instead of asking?
Yes.
Okay, like, sorry. We have a fantastic math teacher at Turner High School who right out of the gate started using Padlet in ways that I was not expecting. And so he'll pose a question, a math question, and then students video themselves answering it. So usually it's just them writing down their work and they explain step by step. So there's none, their voice, it's only their voice and their writing. And then they post it in Padlet, and then everybody goes in, watches them do that one problem, and then makes comments on it. And I was like, oh, it's so interactive. And I was like, oh, it's math. Like it, it kind of blew my mind. We've also been doing Waterfall, which you get to play, oh gosh, no, I can't think of it. TLCs, is that right? Don't go chasing waterfalls.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So the kids won't know, and you'll, if you're
You have to be of a certain age for that one.
Yeah, you'll forget. But basically you ask them a question, and it works in English, it works in all contents. You ask them a question and then they do the work in the chat, and then you give them however long. And then when you're ready, you say, okay, waterfall, and then the results all trickle in because they push post at the same time. And then you get a really nice stream of ideas, and you can group them by common mistakes, common, correct answers, that type of like low stress participation has been really successful because our students don't know each other, especially the freshmen. Like they're in a new building, they're uncomfortable. It's a new learning style. It's very, very stressful, I guess. What are they? You guys already mentioned that there were some websites and maybe resources that you weren't familiar with. Are there, what are your go-to sources?
Honestly, I love Teachers Pay Teachers, and I love Google because they have so many good things. That there's a lot of teachers who've thought of like so many different things, and some of it's even free. So probably I'm learning how to create stuff myself, but they have a lot of like resources there. I also go like to some other teachers in my building who I think are doing some pretty cool stuff, or people who have done something in the past. So just using people, and then Google can be very specific in what you find too.
Yeah.
So you stole my my answer, because for me, I go directly to my department and ask them questions. There's so much experience in our department and so many creative ideas. So that's my number one resource.
Yeah, I would definitely say peers and coaches, and depending on the curriculum you have. I know mine actually does professional development and kind of has a lot of different resources on collaboration and different like problem-based tasks and things like that. So, and they, I don't know if other schools use Slack, but there's a lot of different Slack channels for math teachers that you could potentially become a part of. So that could be one too.
Is that a site? I've never heard of that one.
Oh, Slack? No, Slack is it's like a texting kind of. It's like GroupMe. Like you have to be part of a group, but you can, I think there are a lot of ways that you can find them, and it's free. So ways to collaborate kind of with people all over the country, really, which has been great. That's the internet.
Yeah.
Like learn honestly, like Reddit and things like that. Like you can like get on and see what other folks are doing, even like math teachers specifically.
Yeah, I was gonna say too, even like social media platforms like Facebook, there's, I'm a part of like a culturally responsive teaching group, and there's all kinds of different teaching groups that you can find, and there's lots of good ideas that come up on those kinds of things too. You kind of got to filter through them, but you definitely can find some starting points. And some of those sites that we found for today were also that same kind of way, where it just might live as a starting point for teachers to be able to get some ideas and how to incorporate some of these topics. Speaking of topics, what are some of the ways, Sarah, you mentioned financial literacy as a way that you've kind of embedded. What are some other topics that are really relevant to students that you've been able to sort of embed into your work with students? And then what do you notice? Maybe just talk a little bit too about what you notice about students and their levels of engagement and learning when you're doing that kind of work.
I'll jump in here. I appreciated what Jennifer said in her video, using, recent events and those things, and teaching the statistics class is perfect for this year. One thing we haven't done much with the election, but we've done a lot with COVID, and going back to this idea of looking at COVID in Kansas City. If you go to Open Data KC, you can find all the data by zip codes. So we can compare zip codes compared to the COVID cases, looking at number of tested. Now, some of it's not complete, but you still get some good information there, some good conclusions from that. And the kids are really interested in that. They want to go to look at their area code, their zip code, and how many have been tested, and what's the positivity right here. And they're very engaged when it's relevant to them right here in Kansas City. I think for a lot of my kids, when we talked about the election or politics, it's kind of one of those distant things out there. And I've loved the emphasis this year from everywhere. I don't care if it's NFL or the politicians themselves, go vote. So many of my kids I've seen a little more disengaged with that. Not engaged with that, thinking that their vote doesn't matter or whatever. But I think that emphasis has been good. But as far as engagement, I've seen so much in the stats class with that, making that very relevant to where they live.
Yeah.
So
We actually, going off of that, we have like a jumpstart session. So before regular school, we have a course, like an elective course students can take. And we did ours all on like redlining in the Kansas City area. So like intentional sectioning of areas in Kansas City where certain people were basically forced to live or move out of. And it was just really impactful, and it really resonated with students because it's something they see and experience every single day. And it kind of helped a lot of things click for them. And it's like, just because it affects their lives directly. And I feel like anytime that we talk about something like any issues related to race or equity, gender equity is a big one that I've seen a lot of people getting a lot of students rather getting a lot more interested in discussing. I feel like one of the most important, even for a math classroom, is having like structures in place. Like, do students know how to effectively have like a restorative circle? Do students know how to like interact and speak with one another if they don't agree? Or things like that, I think, are still really important in math and science, because it's honestly the content is just as political as like an English or social studies course. It's just, it's everywhere, and understanding how to talk about it and look at it is really important.
You mentioned using neutral language, for those in elementary circles, we often call that accountable talk. I don't know if you've heard that terminology,
Oh, yeah.
but just, equipping students with the language, like you said, to have those critical conversations with each other. I think that's really important.
Sorry, my unmute button is like at the very bottom. This is my favorite question, so I want to make sure that we get to it.
I've been saving it for you, Chaur.
Thank you. Thank you. I was like, here we go. What questions can educators ask to start conversations in their schools or community that will lead to anti-racist actions? I'm like, yes, everybody's thinking.
One question I often ask, I find myself asking this a lot more, being where we are right now in the pandemic, is would this be acceptable in the county next door? That's kind of what I always have to ask myself and even my administrator, since I teach in KCK, like I said, and we are right next door to Shawnee Mission, Olathe, all those places, and I'm like, would this be acceptable there? And if the answer is no, then why is it good enough for our kids? Or why are we doing it to our kids? And that kind of changes the perspective, I think, and the way we think about stuff. I loved, Brian, when you were talking in your video about the expectations that we have for kids, and not, enabling and then really insisting that they give their very best. I think right now specifically, we're like, oh, it's okay. They can't do it, or they shouldn't have to do it, or they may not be able to do it. And it's like, no, next door, can they do that? No. So then why can our kids have that same, get out of jail free card if they don't need it?
That's a good one.
Yeah, it is.
A great question.
I guess another one to kind of push that thinking too is like, how is that really helping them? Because I know it's so, I don't know if ingrained is the right word, particularly in white educators that I've noticed, is that you want to save students, right? And that's a pervasive idea that is enabling. So I feel like I'm just imagining the conversations I've had with other teachers that are doing more than what students need in an enabling way. And I feel like I always tend to ask, like, how exactly is that helping the students? And like unpack what's the outcome here. And I don't know, that's not as good of a question as what Sara said, but
No, I love
that's
just giving somebody the opportunity to unpack their thinking is powerful. And you've got to start somewhere. well said. Brian?
I can't come up with anything better than those two.
And forgive me too. I pushed the envelope a lot because that was actually one of the reasons I became a teacher, was recognizing discrepancies between KCK, where I went to school at, versus Shawnee, where some of my friends went to school at. So that's kind of like my go-to. And
You have to push the envelope.
See, in our demographics, I'm in Turner, so it's right in between Shawnee Mission and KCK, and makes like a little circle, kind of like Center School District in Missouri, and we're our own little island. And sometimes it feels like it's a very small group of us pushing the envelope. But kind of like Jennifer said, just giving somebody, asking the question, just how did the Black kids do? How did your Latinx kids do? You know, are any of your LGBTQ kids participating at all? And then they have to start, teachers start realizing that they haven't examined anything from a cultural or racial lens. And I think, especially in my personal life, I was raised not to talk about race. You don't look at race, everybody's the same. I was very much colorblind. And I think since this is the Midwest and the majority of educators are white, we were probably all raised very similarly. And, you have to be taught how to not be colorblind. So asking questions, I think, is a gentle way, as I said before, like it's just a gentle way to start sneaking in there.
Very true.
Well,
And
kind of jumping on what you said, I think, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Brian.
Well, I was just going to say, kind of what you were saying is it has to be intentional. It's not going to happen by chance. You have to be intentional, not just as, an individual, but as a department, as a school. So anyway, that's all I was going to say.
Well, I think, we're really at the last, we might have time for one more question. I was going to say, Brian, that was kind of like a nice final statement. Intentionality is kind of a great word to kind of sum up this work, I think, to some degree. But I'm going to ask one other question that kind of to tie things up here. As you kind of think about all we've talked about, and we talked about this a little bit right before we started today, before we went live, but what are some of the ways that you are continuously striving to understand and learn about your students' lived experiences that kind of help you create this environment for your students?
One thing that we do, I didn't do it before I started working at Crossroads, but it's kind of part of what we do at the beginning of every school year, is home visits. And unfortunately with COVID, that hasn't really been a thing, but visiting students at their homes means so much. And it's just getting to see who they are and where they're living and meeting their families, and just, having a nice conversation, because they're going to be part of your family for at least the next year. So I think home visits is a really big, and we've been kind of dropping off devices and things. And I actually dropped one off for a student yesterday, and I really miss that connection. We can't do home visits, and I want to go drop off devices and see students, where they live. And I think it's meaningful for them to see that their teachers, coming out of our way to really see us as people, I think means a lot.
Yeah.
Could you restate that question?
I just asked, what are some of the ways that you are continuously striving to understand and learn about your students and their lives and their experiences?
So I've never done home visits at the high school level. I've never gone to and done that at the beginning of the year, but I know for one, it's the connection. And with COVID, it's difficult, face to face. But one thing I've always done is been at, I think we mentioned earlier, the extracurricular events, going to football games, going to the soccer games. The kids see me at almost all those events because I'm working the scoreboard or I'm working whatever. and not just, you know, slipping in and doing the scoreboard and leaving, but stopping and talking with kids, and just that, you know, investing in their lives outside of the classroom. I think that's so important.
Yeah.
So.
I agree with that. I also I live up the street from my school, so I kind of get to see them outside in their own environment. But since we've been online, I haven't had a chance to really like get to know them as well as I wanted. So I've been starting my days with a conversation starter of like this or that. Like today's was would you rather never have winter or never have summer? And so when I'm asking those questions, they start talking about their own personal experiences, their own personal lives with it. And so it's like me still finding a way to connect with them, so I know what to incorporate into our math problems. But I definitely agree, just kind of being out in their own environment is helpful, and seeing them outside of the classroom.
Well, I think that brings us to our 5:30 mark, and we've lost Chaur. That happened to me in the last webinar. I got kicked out. But I just want to thank all of our panelists today. We could continue this conversation for a while, I'm sure, and I would love to continue it again maybe down the road. So thank you all very much for participating today, and thanks to those of you that stayed on and watched. And we will just continue to learn. And like I said in the recording, you know, I think when we know better, we do better. And as we continue to learn and just really be intentional, I love that word that you used, Brian, being intentional about the decisions that we make, and asking questions and asking critical questions of the people that we work and collaborate with on a regular basis. So I know I am constantly trying to learn and be better. So I thank you all for doing this work, and thanks for being with me today. So have a great night.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.